And hopefully it'll record right. I had one that didn't record right last session. Anyway, what we're going to do is we're going to study about Mark, the Gospel of Mark. And the way we're going to do it, this class is kind of different. Those of you who've been in my classes before, you know kind of how they go. But if you haven't, raise your hand if you haven't been in my classes before. Okay? These classes are a little bit different than what you might be used to, because what I try not to do is I don't want to touch on, well, I'm not really into opinion. I mean, I'm sure you don't want to know my opinion about these things. I mean, what is my opinion worth, right? If you say, well, what do you think about it? Well, who cares what I think about it, right? It's not what you think about it, it's what you can prove is true or not true about something. And it doesn't matter what we, for example, our opinions about words. In Greek words, and we're going to learn that, that's one of the things we'll learn about Greek words. Mark is written in Greek. It's not written in English, it's not written in Latin, it's not written in Hebrew, it's written in Greek. And Greek is a very specific kind of language. It's very different than English, and that's something we're going to learn about, because you need to learn about the language itself, and then we'll actually look at the words. And I'm going to talk about some words in Greek. This is Greek, so if it looks like Greek to you, it is, so that's okay. I also gave you, this is, I call them gouge sheets, cheat sheets. My wife tells me I'm supposed to call them note sheets, but it's something like that. But these are sheets that give you some information about the words of the day that we'll look at, and also about the course. There's a course outline in here. I usually kind of stick to it or not. We try to kind of fall into the major category of each of the course parts. And then I've given you the Greek letters and kind of the English translations, because they don't exactly translate. But in this class, you say, well, what can we study if we don't study opinion? Well, what we study is we look at history. You know, historical facts are something that I can prove. And historical conjecture is something we can talk about. That's the opinion of people about history. That's kind of a good thing to talk about, too. We can look at that from a historical standpoint. We can look at culture. That's something that's very different to most of us, because we live in a culture that is, for example, obviously none of you guys are classic Greeks, right? Because you're not wearing, well, they didn't wear togas. And I can't remember, I try to always remember the names of these things, but it depends on the period. But I think Hapaion in the inner garb and the outer garb, I have to look that up. I didn't put that in my notes. But anyway, the different types of garb that they wear. So it's kind of like a toga, but not really a toga. But you're not wearing it, right? So you're obviously wearing clothes within your culture. You're wearing jewelry within their culture. You look like you fit within your culture. Greek culture is significantly different than English culture, than our culture. As a matter of fact, English culture, like in Britain, English culture is significantly different than our American culture. They even use different words, if you didn't know. You know, like a lorry or a boot. Boot's the back of a car, the trunk of a car. You know, they use a lot of different words that we don't use in different ways than we use, and they even have grammatical differences. You don't say that I go to the hospital, I say I go to hospital. So they're unique, and both small things and large things that are different in different cultures. And do you think they're huge? You know, ancient Greek culture is 2,000 years ago. So do you think there's a huge difference or a small difference? It's enormous. It's enormous. The way we do things and think about things is significantly different. So in the class, what I want to focus on is, number one, culture. Number two, history. And number three, the language, linguistics, the language of the people, of the Greeks. And then what we do is, in the classes, what I'll try to do is feed you pieces parts. So we will actually look at the Greek language at each part. If you have an NIV, that works great. It doesn't really matter the translation. As a matter of fact, if you have different translations around the room, that's really good too, because then we can compare and contrast how they were translated. And what's really neat is the Greek language itself. Because, we have an opinion. I talked even to someone last night about the opinion of interpretation. it's really difficult to interpret Greek. Do you know why? Because there's no interpretation. It says something, and it says it straight out. And so there's not a lot to interpret. The problem in English, there's a lot to interpret, because English, and I'm going to bring some terms in here, we'll explain it as we go along, as we get into the different subject matter, but English is what we call a very euphemistic language. In English, for example, the word love can cover a gazillion types of love. I say I love my pet, I love my cat, I love my wife, I love my pizza, right? I love my sofa, I love my house. But I guarantee you love them all in different ways. The Greeks are pretty bright about that. They have a different word for each type of love. But in English, what do we do?
Context.
Well, but we translate all those words as love, which is kind of a problem, right? And I've got an example. Here's a beautiful example. Here's your...
Senator Heads, well, he doesn't really love his cell phone, he just likes it. But we accept love.
Yeah. Well, the problem is in English, the definition of love is like this long, right? Well, actually, this long if you get the Cambridge edition. I think it's like 10 pages. So, so what do you do with it? Well, this is really neat, because what we're going to look at, let's look at, for example, Greek words for say and said. And I'll give you, this is a little primer. If you look, don't try to interpret this. I'm going to do this really quickly. But this is basically, this is anglicized, okay, Greek. So I'm turning the Greek letters into English letters. But E-I-R-O, euro. Euro, what does euro mean? I gave you notes right here. Now you say, what is the first aorist passive? Now, one thing I'm not going to try to do and teach you in Greek, I'm not going to try to teach you Greek, as in the sense of teach you how to decline Greek verbs or nouns, right? I'm going to try to stick to the words themselves, but aorist, what this is the word say and said is what kind of word? It's a verb, right? If I say something, it's a verb. Said is the past tense. So, right, you guys remember all that. I'm going to bring grammar in this, so you don't have to go re-study grammar. I'll try to explain it to you. But all that stuff you forgot about grammar, it's helpful. So, in any case, this is a first aorist passive. It means literally, it was said. So in English, the first aorist passive in English is basically, it was said. But we didn't know that, right? We didn't get taught that in our grammar, unfortunately. Sorry. But that's what this word means. It was said. P-R-O-E-I-P-O-N. Proepipon. This word means, this is a future tense word. It's future words said in the past. It literally means to say before. So,
foretell?
No, not exactly, because this word, this means in a verbal, in a sense of a verb. That if I said it, if I, proepipon, it means that I basically I'm saying this, I've said this in the past. So I told you, like when you tell your child, right?
I told you so.
I told you once, I told you twice, I told you chicken soup with rice, right? So this is what you tell your child, except the Greeks have a word for it. See? So when you tell your child this, they kind of know what's going to happen next. This is the one foretell, P-R-O-L-E-G-O, prolego. And this is a word we're going to see over and over and over again, Lego. When we get to Lego, we'll talk about Lego. I'm just going to do an overview. We'll get in more depth about some of these words. Prolego means to, well, you guys remember the ACT and SAT stuff that you've forgotten already? Try to remember it. Pro means what? Before. Before. So a prolego means, Lego means an argument, a logical argument in Greek. We'll get that when we get to Lego. But a prolego means a foretelling or a prophecy. So we have a word for that, prophecy. But you notice in Greek, to us a prophecy is what? A prophecy isn't really a say or said, right? It's a prophecy is a prophecy is a noun, right? This is a verb in Greek. So, what would you guess? Just give me a guess. What would you guess when a culture begins to make something like, when a culture has it as a verb as opposed to a noun? What do you think that thinks about? They think about it. Then it's true. Yeah, it can be done. In our culture, we don't believe in prophecy, right? That's our culture. But the Greeks did, so much so they had a verb for it. Let's see, how about this? Antipon. Antipon. Well, antipon. Ooh. Anybody who studied music, you know what an antipon is, right? Literally, I won't go into the musical definition, but in Greek, this means an antipon is words against that were said in the past. Words against that were said in the past. It's a verb. So, basically, what would we say in English for this? I told you so, right? But in Greek, I got a whole verb. I got a single verb that I can tell you, I told you so. So if I come in and say, hey, I antiponed you, right? I told you so. But you notice, told you so is a what? What is that? What kind of form is that in any language? Well, it's a euphemistic saying. I told you so. It's a euphemistic saying. It's a euphemistic construction. It's a construction in a sentence that means something much deeper than it does, right? See? But we all understand when I say if I tell you it's raining cats and dogs, you don't look out to see the cats and dogs falling. See? That's a very complex euphemism in English. You see? I told you so is a less complex euphemism, but unless you're part of that culture, you don't understand what I told you so meant, right? See? That's why English is a euphemistic language. We'll get more into this. It gets, this is just kind of fun stuff to look at. P-H-A-R-K-O. Parako. Parako. To swear. To affirm or assert. If I say, in English we would swear too. Similar. But that literally means it's one of their say and said words. A-P-O-P-H-P-H-E-N-G-O-M-A-I. Let's see if I can pronounce this. Apophthegome. Close. This is to speak forth. So, for example, to address. This is a saying in Greek. T-O-U-T-E-S-T-I. Todesti. Todesti means that is to say. That is to say. Todesti. Here we go getting into the basic words that we know of. There are 5 basic words for say and said in Greek. Lego. Lego means an argument, and we'll see this word over and over and over again. Because this is a word, for example, logos, this word comes from logos. Logos is a noun. Lego is a verb. Anybody know where we find the famous noun logos? 1 John chapter 1. We also find it.
Not 1 John, just John.
It's John. Well, John the Gospel, in the first chapter of John the Gospel. If you look back, it says, in the beginning was God, and the Word, the Logos, was with God. Do you know what that's a quote of? It's a quote of Genesis 1 in the Septuagint. Because and this is what we're going to learn about. Okay, I know I'm giving you some stuff. If you haven't had this stuff before, we're going to talk about LXX. I get to a little bit about LXX today. LXX is the Septuagint. The Septuagint is a translation of the Hebrew Bible, the Hebrew Tanakh, which includes the Torah and the prophets and the histories. This was translated about 200 BC into Greek. So they translated from Hebrew to Greek. What we'll learn as we go through this class, we're going to learn a little bit about Hebrew. Hebrew is a exceedingly euphemistic language. Probably the only more euphemistic language than Hebrew is Japanese. Modern Japanese is incredibly euphemistic. Hebrew is just a step lower, hardly even a step lower. Arabic is very euphemistic. Have you guys ever noticed, is there any dissension on understanding the Quran? Okay.
People aren't really allowed to ask.
Oh, you're not allowed to ask.
Yeah,
That's true.
it's, you take what the imam says about it, and you don't really, yeah.
Now wait, they all speak Arabic, right? And the Quran is written in Arabic. So how can there be a problem? The problem is that Arabic is very similar to Hebrew. It's a very euphemistic language. So, the problem even the modern Jews have is there are three branches of modern Judaism, right? There's the Reform, the Conservatives, and the Orthodox. There's three groups. And the three groups disagree significantly about what the meaning of the Hebrew is. Now, they didn't before. There's another thing we'll talk about. We're going to get into documents because we have to understand the documents in the past. We have to understand, a lot of things to really dig into the meaning of things or the cultures and things. But what do you think happened when they turned it from Hebrew to Greek? They went from very euphemistic to
Concrete.
very concrete. And so we find in the beginning was God, and in the Septuagint of the Septuagint, in Genesis it said, and God legoed, God spoke, legoed, he gave an argument, and what happened? The world was created. So when John writes basically almost a copy of the Septuagint in his gospel, and he says, in the beginning was God, and the Word, the Logos. In Hebrew, it's the Amar, the command word, was with God. Right? And so, we're not looking at John at this point. Someday I'm going to look at John, but I'll mention to you before. When you translate the words in John, does it mean word? What is a logos, do you think, to a Greek speaker? A logical argument. And since it comes right out of Septuagint and it's talking directly about God's speaking the creation, they're talking about logic. So look at it this way. In the beginning was God, and the logical argument was with God. And God spoke the logical argument, and what happened? The world was created. It's very interesting. So what we've got is Hebrew source that became a Septuagint Greek that then John wrote in Greek. I'm not saying you get a mistranslation, but do you see what happens? I go from very euphemistic to very concrete to euphemistic again. And so this is kind of our problem in languages. Lego is a very critical and important thing because almost all the time when a Greek tells you he's telling you a Lego, that means what? He's given you something he's thought out, a logical argument. Yes, sir?
Aren't we really lucky then that we went from euphemism to concrete back to euphemistic instead of going
I think
euphemistic
so.
to more euphemistic?
Yeah, and I think it's really
almost a level set with the New Testament.
I agree, and I think the level set really becomes when we start looking at the documents in Greek, because Greek is concrete. There can't really be any discussion. There can't be any, unless, and we'll find this out. There are, we'll get to this next week, but there are approximately 175 Greek manuscripts of Mark, and each one is slightly different. And when I say slightly different, I don't mean this huge difference, but they're slightly different. And so, yeah, you could argue about, for example, a verb tense or a noun declination, but what can you not really argue about? Yeah, if it says Lego, then the Greek writer meant Lego. I'm giving you an argument. And we're going to learn about this because Greek literature, I'll give it to you right now. We'll see this over and over again. Does anybody have any idea how we write in English? How are you supposed to write in English?
Intro, body, conclusion.
Intro, body, and conclusion. This is what your teachers tried to teach you. Tried to teach me like for years, right? That when you write a sentence, when you write a paragraph, when you write an essay, when you write a paper, you always write intro, body, conclusion. This came from, anybody know where this came from? Who invented this? The Romans. Romans invented this. Just seems to be a good way of organizing things, right? Anybody know how the Hebrews wrote?
Synopsis, body.
Hebrews wrote synopsis, that's right, synopsis, body. And how do you know? Is anybody, this cracks me up. I've heard this, I always hear this. Okay, how many creation accounts are there?
One.
Two.
But people say two.
How many Noetic accounts are there about Noah and the flood? You see, ancient Hebrew writing is always synopsis body. So in other words, how many accounts will you find?
Should be two in everything.
There should be
One.
two of everything. You'll find one account, but you'll find a synopsis, and then you'll find the body of the text. So the synopsis should be a shortened outline, basically, right? Right. This is what we call the outline. The Hebrews invented the outline. The Hebrews invented a lot of really interesting things in language. But they invented the outline. So, for example, when you get, a PowerPoint slide set, many times you'll get what? An outline. And then you'll have the body of the text, or the body of the pictures and stuff. And that body, does it explain more?
Yes.
Right. So that you find in the first creation account, God created the heavens and the earth, and then you find in the next one that it goes into detail that He did it in so much, periods, etc., etc. So it goes into more detail how He created man and woman, etc., etc. You find that throughout, and this is a characteristic of ancient Hebrew. So English is like this, and Hebrew is like this. Is Greek different? Yeah, Greek is significantly different. Greek is basically what we call logos to telos. And I'm going to go into detail about what a logos to telos is. Logos to telos is basically an argument to an unwritten conclusion. The examples are, and it's my favorite example, I'll use this again, is Aesop's Fables. For example, in Aesop's Fables, everybody's read Aesop's Fables, right? What do they have at the end? A moral, right? Now that moral, has anybody read some of the unexpurgated ones and noticed that the morals don't match very well? Because Aesop's never wrote the morals. Aesop's was a Greek writer. Does anyone know who added the morals?
The Romans.
The Romans added the morals because the Romans said you gotta have a conclusion. See, we don't want our children to not understand the conclusion. Of course, a lot of Aesop's fables are kind of not for children. They're, R-rated and X-rated. So the Romans, guess what they did? They fixed them. And they also made the morals work out to what they thought their culture morals should be. So all of those added morals were added by the Romans because in Greek thought, the fable itself leads you directly to the correct conclusion. Right? So too are the Gospels. So too are the letters of Paul. So too are all ancient Greek documents. And that's generally what we see. And that's what we'll look at in Mark. We're going to go into a lot more detail on this. This class is an introduction. It's an overview of the cultures. Let's look at some stuff. Let's talk, let me finish up the words. Words. R-E-M-A. Rima. Rima, I got your notes right here. A rima is poured out words. Literally, if I tell you I'm going to rima, I'm going to tell you a story. It may be a true story, it may be a false story, but that's what it is, right? Anybody notice, when someone's going to tell a story, what do? They get your attention, and they start giving you the story. Now, a story can be a lot of different levels. You know, it can be a correct historical story, but it's kind of different than a Lego. Obviously, you can see that. This is a FIMI. A FIMI means my opinion. If I'm giving you my opinion, it's a FIMI. I'm going to FIMI you, you know, because that's the verb. It's a verb. This is LELO. LELO means I'm going to do small talk. So we meet on the corner and I say, hey, it's a great day. How's the weather, right? That's LELO. And this is EPO. EPO means literally just said. Past tense said. So, what's interesting, and this is what I want you to key on, is, for example, in Paul's discussion at the Areopagus at Mars Hill in Acts, guess what we find? All 5 of these words used in the Greek, and all of them translated to what? Said. When Jesus is before his accusers in front of the Sanhedrin, about 3 of these words are used. Jesus Christ says, I'm going to give you a Lego. The high priest says, ask the people that are bringing the accusations against Jesus, tell us your FIMI, your opinion. Do you think it's important to recognize the different word usage? Because if a speaker, or if a writer, for example, in Mark says, I'm going to rima you, you would automatically know a rima is a story. If he says, I'm going to lelo you, it's small talk. If he says, and by the way, which is very interesting, in Acts, for example, Paul tells the followers to convert people through lelo. We translate it by preaching. But what does lelo mean?
Everyday conversation.
Daily conversation.
Through everyday conversation.
Part of your life.
So, you know, I'm not going to get into translation issues here, but is there a big difference between if someone tells you to convert someone by preaching and someone tells you to convert by everyday conversation? So, what I'm trying to show you is that in the Greek is incredibly concrete. We find 10 words for, well, actually there's about 20 or 30 words for assemblies. We're going to talk about that. The Great Assembly. Anybody know what the Great Assembly is that we all know about? The Ecclesia. The Ecclesia means the Athenian democracy. That's what the word was used, is the Athenian democracy. But what does Ecclesia translate to in the New Testament?
Church.
Church. The Orthodox call their churches ecclesias. So, you know, this has got some pretty deep ramifications. Because if I say the word ecclesia to you, you think of, you know, and you know that it means the Athenian democracy. And I say the word church to you. Do they both bring different kind of things in your mind? Right? So what I would like us to do is, the reason I use the Greek words, the reason we get into culture and history, is because I'd really like you to start thinking like Greeks. Like ancient Greeks. I'd like you to be able to shed your cultural blinders. We all have cultural blinders. And not live like the Greeks. Don't do that. They had some issues. Okay? But shed your cultural blinders so you can see how they lived and how they thought. Don't judge them. I mean, you wouldn't want to be judged by a Greek, I guarantee you. By the way, in the ancient world, if they judge you and they find you lacking, what is the normative end of you? They kill you. In the ancient world, you know, we think of the cosmopolitan world. Think of our cosmopolitan world. I go to Europe on vacation. You know, I go down to the Bermuda or Bahamas. I can go to Mexico, most places kind of safely. What happens when you go to Ethiopia, Sudan? Right? You look different. You talk different. Your culture's different. You know, if you're lucky, you won't end up, you know, with a slit throat in the back alley in some of those countries, right? Even some of the countries in Europe. You know, some of the ex-East German countries, you know, you hear people's stories. Some of them are really positive and some are very negative. Depends on where you go in Russia, ex-Soviet Union, ex-Soviet states. You know, if you go to a lot of Muslim nations, don't bring your Bibles.
Oh, yeah.
Okay? Don't bring your crosses. What do they do? Anybody have an idea if you go to Saudi Arabia with the Bible in your hand?
Kill you.
Well, in Saudi Arabia, they'll take your Bible and they basically will burn it. They'll desecrate
If
and
you're
burn
caught
it.
going to church in Saudi Arabia,
Yeah.
like a secret church, you could get killed.
That's right. This is true. China is supposedly letting, you know, but, okay, this is our world, right? Now, take that back 2,000 years. And think about it. It's even worse. Let's talk about that. Let's look at, like, culture. Culture in the ancient world. I'm going to talk more about the biblical documents and the documents. You know, I don't like to use words. Let me caveat some stuff and give you some stuff. I don't like to use the word Bible because I like to use the word New Testament and Old Testament documents. So, well, why would you do that? Because if you have a collection of Old Testament, New Testament documents on your desk at work, is there a problem? Now, if you have a Holy Bible on your desk, could there be a problem? See, part of the problem is in infiltrating cultures, and that's what we're going to be talking about a little bit, infiltrating cultures, what do you not want to do to the culture you're infiltrating? Yeah, you don't want to intentionally offend them. I mean, there might be times to purposely offend them, but you really don't want to offend them. You want to assimilate and bring in, right? So, hopefully the knowledge that I will be able to give you will let you, for example, speak to people that you know. Because a lot, we'll see next week especially. But a lot of times people assume what about the New Testament documents?
Sacred.
It's like religious. It's
Yeah.
not historical.
Not his.
Well, maybe a little, but it's mythical too. Like, you know, with the miracles and.
Yeah, mythical, you know, not historical. What we're going to look at next week is we're going to look specifically at the veracity of the documents. And, you know, I'll get into this more next week, but the big deal is if you go to a class, let's say a historical class, your professor, I believe, if you're taking a history class, should prove the veracity of the historical documents he's using, right? So he should prove that the historical veracity of Josephus, if he's talking about the 1st century. He should prove the veracity of Hippolytus and Theodocles and, you know, Pliny and Caesar, if he's teaching a class in that period, right? So when you teach a class in history, you should always prove the veracity of the documents and prove how good of a historical source they are. Because if they're a good historical source, what does that mean?
You can trust the contents pretty well.
Yeah, you can trust the contents, you can trust them, you can use them. Okay? If you can't trust them, what then do you have to do?
Look for other material.
Well, you can look for other material, that's what's really neat about this class. And in this class, we're going to focus on Mark. Next week, I'm going to prove to you the veracity of Mark. But then I'll also pull in a lot of other documents because, you know, for example, the Septuagint sources, the Talmudic sources, the Mishnah sources, Mishnah and Talmud are the Jewish documents that, you know, support or not support, right? There are other historical documents of the period that we can look at and trust or not trust. We'll see. So we can also look at the documents as literature. We won't have to do that, but you can bring in literary sources. For example, if I want to study about Victorian England, what is one of the great fictional source documents I can use?
Like Dickens?
Dickens. Dickens. You know, Oliver Twist, right? Was Dickens totally reflective of his culture? Yeah, he lived in it. Now, his fictional stories are fictional stories, but he was representing his culture. The thing is that if you study history, you bring in, for example, a literary source. However, I will assure you, we won't need to do that. We'll look at veracity. You probably, I don't know, has anybody studied veracity in a course other than mine? Like in a college course or something? Now, isn't that odd? Why would that be? You know, the number one thing you do in engineering science or in you know, physical science is you do what? You prove your facts. Right? You test your facts. So how could you study history without proving the documents? So I'm going to tell you, you're always shortchanged. If your professors or your teachers did not prove the historical veracity of the text before they taught them to you, then they shortchange you. Because number one, how could you trust the text they were using? And the example is Josephus, I mentioned before. Almost, if you go to Fringe University or Newman University, you go to almost any university around here, and you study a class in the first century, they'll bring out Josephus, and they'll say, Josephus is our source. And you ask, prove it. I'm going to prove it, whether Josephus is a good source or not, for you. We'll look at that. But more so, we'll look at Mark. And that's what you're interested in, right? Is Mark a viable source? Is it a valid source? That's the question I had when I was young anyway. So, let's see. Look at this. Also, let's mention this really quickly. If you have a lot of different words for say and said in your language, and you have a specific word that means to argue or an argument or a logical argument, how important do you think words are to your culture? Now English has over 1 million words now. But we still we do have multiple words for say and said. But yet they're very contextual, very specific, right? They're not exactly like we see in the Greek. In other words, we have 5 very simple words that the Greeks use all the time to describe the way they are saying things. Wouldn't you love us if when the news broadcaster came on TV and they said, I'm fimming you, right? Or I'm rimming you, right? Or when he says good morning, he says, I'm Lalo, right? And that way they identify. You see what we don't do in English? Isn't that interesting? Because in English, even though we have 1 million words, what do we like to leave? Lots of wiggle room. And isn't that interesting? Because do you kind of see wiggle room in our culture? Euphemistic cultures tend to leave themselves lots of wiggle room. Very interesting. So communication is very important to the Greeks. And that's why, by the way, almost all the words, well, okay, there are some Chinese sources, but how many are there in the ancient period? Not a whole lot. No histories, right? But are there a lot of Greek histories? Yeah. How about Roman histories? Lots of Roman histories. And so the Greeks were very interested in history. And so when we find Greek documents, especially in the ancient period, we're looking at documents of historical repute, of some historical nature, and that's exactly what Mark is. Let's talk about the culture a little bit. The Greek specifically is an established Oriental monarchy. Now, you'll say, okay, the Athenians aren't a monarchy. They had a king. The king was elected, kind of. Let me get a little bit into the Athenian democracy. Did anybody know how the Athenian democracy really worked? See, in school they always tell you about how they tell you about the Athenian democracy, but they never tell you how it worked. In the Athenian democracy, everybody in Athens, here's Athens, the city, it's a city-state. By the way, the ancient world is city-states. There are no states like we think of states. There are only city-states. And so Athens is a city-state, and it's one of many. There's Thebes, there's Athens, there's Macedon, there's Sparta, right, to name a few. There's many city-states. And Athens city-states, and I'm just going to draw it like this. This isn't exactly how it is, but if you imagine, for example, the voting districts in Wichita, Kansas, okay, these are all the voting districts for Athens, right? And these are all called demis. Demis. And everybody in the demi gets a turn to represent their demi. Their demi is basically equivalent to a family or tribe. So we call it a family or a clan or a tribe. But your demi represents, you can be selected as a male. If you're a male, and I don't know how much, well, I guess I'll start with this. Okay. if you were a male in Athens, what happens to you is you are raised up to puberty in the gynoeceum. Now you say, what is a gynoeceum? In ancient Greek culture is an Oriental culture. It's Oriental. It's Oriental until, anybody know when it changed to a Western culture? You mix Greek with Christianity, you get a Western culture. So the beginning of Western culture was when I mixed Greek with Christianity. So Greek culture is an Oriental culture. Now in a middle class and an upper level class Greek home, here's the home. Very simple model. In the back, first floor, is a thing called the gynoeceum. In the gynoeceum, gyno means wife or woman, and a ceum is a place. And what happened is, anytime the family, members of the family were in the house, the women could be anywhere in the house. But anytime there was a free male in the house who was not a member of the family, the women of the house, not the slaves, but the women of the house, which was the wife generally and the children, would be in the gynoeceum. It's in Oriental cultures, we usually call this a harem, right? Our idea of a harem is there are a lot of women and a lot of wives, but in the Greek culture, there's usually only one wife. The Greeks usually only had one wife, and the woman would be in a gynoeceum. Now, we know in the lower level cultures and the lower middle class that may or may not be true, but when you were born, you know, when a woman married, well, before a woman married, where would she be? In her father's gynoeceum. And her father then would marry her off. I'm not going to talk about Greek marriage customs right now. We'll get into ancient marriage customs at some point. But when he married her off to her husband, the husband would take her to his gynoeceum. And she would be there. Usually, you know, it's not the greatest life in living. However, what you have to realize is this. Where is the rule of law in the world? There really isn't any. There's no police. Who protects you? Your husband, your father, your Jimmy, your family, right? That's who protects you. And women, okay, a woman alone on the street, who is she? Who is the woman on the street? She is either a slave. 75% of the women in Greek culture at this point in time. Remember, get this clear in your minds. Until the 1830s, every culture in the world was a slave-based culture. At this time in the Greek world, 75% of the people in Athens were slaves, and of those, about 3/4 were women. So if a person is on the street, they are likely a woman slave. If it's a woman, it's a slave. A hori, which is a prostitute, a paid prostitute. Usually she wore a head covering, so she was known to be a prostitute. A low-class woman, or a lower middle-class woman, who would be equivalent in their minds to, even though she was free, she'd probably be equivalent in their minds to a hori or a slave, right? Those are the only women you'd see on the street. Now, the thing is that a woman on the street without a man, anyone ever been to the Middle East? What happens to women that are alone without men in a Middle Eastern country?
Bad things.
Very bad things. They can be raped. In fact, if you looked at any of the things happening in Egypt, you know, during the riots, they were raping, you know, the women reporters. You know, that's reporters. They get reported. But what were they doing to their own people, right? Because they have no respect for women. If a woman is not wearing a head covering, that indicates that she's married or that she's like a single woman, because they do indicate it the way the burqas are, then they can be raped on the street if they are not. Matter of fact, they warned military women to wear burqas, full burqas in certain countries to prevent them from being raped and accosted on the street. So, you know, this is an Oriental culture. Have these cultures changed in 2,000 years? They may have gotten better. They may have gotten worse. We don't know. But remember, there's no rule of law. So the reason that women were in a gynoeceum is to what?
Protect them.
Protect them, okay? We misinterpret this. I taught the judges class. Remember I told you in Judges, when a woman's left out in the field, is that bad or good?
Bad.
That's horrible, because it means her husband or her father intentionally left her without any protection. Okay? There is some hope for these women, because what happens in the ancient world if you sexually bother a woman? If you rape a woman, or you sexually, does anyone know? Yeah, you're required to marry them or pay the tax. So a whore, right, a prostitute, what she does is she negotiates her price and has sex, and then there is no commitment for marriage. But a man who takes a free woman on the street, okay, what happens then? He is obligated by the culture to marry her. This is true in almost all ancient cultures. He's obligated by the culture to take her home. Now I'm going to segue into another idea. This is a starvation culture. All these cultures in the ancient world are starvation cultures. There's not enough food, generally. Why do you think they have female slaves? They don't eat as much. They're better to look at, right? And there's other reasons that, the males in the culture would want to have female slaves in their culture. But a lot of it is because they don't eat as much. So, if you accost a woman on the street who's a free woman, now what?
That's gonna
You gotta take
cost you
responsibility
big
for
time.
it.
Now you got to take responsibility for her. Now, if she's a married woman, what's going to happen? The husband and the demi are going to come get you. The rich men, the rich and middle class men, want to ensure what?
Protection and continuation of their families.
Protection and continuation of their families, and specifically their DNA. Because, if your woman is out in the society at large, in our Oriental societies, what's a constant worry in all societies? That she'd be accosted and impregnated by another man. Of course, she would never tell you, right? Because that might mean that something bad would happen to her. So, these things are cultural. In our culture, we've kind of changed a little bit in the way we think about things. I don't know if that's good or bad. Obviously good about gynoeciums, but realize that without rule of law, where do you want to be? Right? I mean, these are stark choices in the ancient world, and the ancient world solved all these problems. I'll also mention this. In societies that have a lot of problems with, think about it. In our Western culture, how do we pass on the kingship? And I'm talking about Latin specifically. It's a little bit different in Anglo-Saxon cultures, but in Latin cultures, like French, how do they pass on the kingship?
Male succession usually.
By male succession. In Hebrew, how do we know that you're a Jew or not? In Hebraic thought. From your mother. And this is true in almost all Oriental societies. Oriental societies, many of them had succession of the males through inheritance, but usually, who determined the male? Who was to be the successor? The mother. The mother. Why is that?
Because you know for sure the baby has to be hers.
That's right. You know for sure the mother, that baby is hers, so therefore the DNA gets passed on. And so in almost all Oriental cultures, why? I don't know, but they had some issues with adultery. They had some issues with this, and so their solution was the gynoecium. So anyway, if you're a male, you're raised till puberty in the gynoecium. Then you become a free man and you're allowed to run the house. And guess who's training you? Your father, right? And then after you reach a certain point, and we're not exactly sure it was different in the different Greek cultures, you then went to train with the army. Not just the Spartans, but by taking, what you did is you took your responsibility. Every Greek male took his responsibility and learned to be a Hippolyte. Basically, he learned to be a soldier for that Greek city-state. And then when you were about 32 years old, you were declared to be a man. And you weren't really mustered out, but you became a man. When you got your credentials as a man, now you can become married. at 32. You're starting your family at 32. I don't know if they were self-depleting themselves or not, but you know, that it seems like a late age, especially in an age when
When the life expectancy was so much.
How long did the average person live in that age?
it's really difficult to tell, but we know that, see, the problem is, what is the average age of life is really dependent on children's dying, see, infant mortality. And so the infant mortality was very high, but people who tended to live, you know, for a long time. They had less accidents than we do, and they tended to be more isolated. So we're not sure about, you know, like diseases and stuff. We assume the diseases were about the same. I'll talk about diseases at some point because we'll get into that. That's a very important topic about the ancient world that most people don't know. But, you know, we know that people lived into their 80s and 90s, right? And in the biblical claims, people lived up into the hundreds, right? And so there are also issues. We'll talk about numbers. Numbers are a huge issue. Anybody know why numbers are an issue?
It counted different for one. They didn't have an idea of the scale
Have
numbers.
zeros.
Yeah,
I'm going to do a very quick segue because I want to talk about numbers very quickly. Numbers are very important in our discussions of everything. So, the Romans, what kind of base number system did the Romans have? All right?
Letters or numbers.
Let me tell you, tell me again after we do this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. What base do they have?
base
Base 5.
Okay.
They're base 5. How do you know?
five. That's,
Everything's divisible
Yeah.
by position.
as they repeat it. Right, and they start repeating it.
Okay, the
Didn't have zeros.
okay. Now I'm going to simplify this for you, but okay, this we know Roman numerals, and I'm not going to draw the Egyptian, but I'm just going to give you the Egyptians were like this: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Oh, that's yeah, 6, 7, 8, etc., 2, 10. So what base are they? They're base 10. They're base 10. They're using tally marks. They don't change their marks until they get to, and this isn't exactly what they do, but it's very close. Okay? Now, here's the Greeks. Alpha, Bravo, Gamma, Delta, Delta, Ellipson, Iota. See, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. What are they? What's their base? They're kind of base 10-ish, but they use the letters for the numbers. Now, who else uses letters for numbers? We know. The Hebrews did like crazy. Well, the Romans use numbers, but they're singular numbers, right? Like, if, for example, if I were a Greek and I wrote like alpha, 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 right, for 1, 2, and 3, then that would be similar to what the Romans did. So they had their own specific thing. So what the Romans or what the Greeks did is very similar to what the Hebrews do. Now, to connote that they were numbers, what they did is they put a mark, a hash mark. So to make sure that I knew that this was not. Now the problem I have is this. What do we know about Greeks? There's a hash mark like this, but what also does Greek have?
Accent mark.
Accent marks. Yeah. So how do I know it's an accent mark or a letter? We got a problem, right? Problem. Now, what did Hebrews do? Hebrews didn't have an accent mark, and they didn't indicate. So when I'm reading ancient documents, what problem do I potentially have?
Can't tell when they're using numbers.
Yeah. Well, they use the numbers and letters. And the other problem I have is, look, can you guys count to 100? Can you count to 1,000?
Yes.
Can you count to 1,000,000?
Yes.
How high could people count in the ancient world?
Not very high.
20.
Yeah,
Fingers and toes.
Toes and fingers.
That is literally true. As a matter of fact, in Hebrew, the word for 6 means 5 fingers plus 1. In ancient world, the way that I knew I could do things, and by the way, how high can I count with 2? 40, right? 40 days and 40 nights is what? A long period of time, because it's as high as I can count with 2 people. Why 2 people?
Going to audit.
On to audit.
One to audit? No, that's when we get to 4. No, with 2 people, I have 1 person a buyer and 1 person a seller. Okay? Now with 3 people, I'll do this really quickly, we'll talk more next week, but with 3 people I have a priest. Because I have a buyer, a seller, and the priest takes the way. Well, the God's part,
Yeah.
right? And who gave us base 60 numbers? The Babylonians gave us base 60 for seconds, minutes, because it was important to their system, but they could count to 60 because they had
3 people.
3 people. They had a priest, they had the buyer and the seller, basically the people bringing
All their fingers and
the
toes.
goods. See? So we think that these things are arbitrary. Nothing is arbitrary in history. Nothing is arbitrary. That's what we'll be discussing. We'll be looking more and more in culture to see how the cultures fit. Because once we understand the culture, what can we understand? The language and what they're saying. That's exactly right. Then we can understand what they're saying. Otherwise, it's like we're at the stage play without a bulletin, without, an understanding of what's going on. Thank you, Father, for your word. We pray that you look after us this week. Take care of us. We thank you for your word. In your name we pray. Amen.